Chapter 1. The Inheritance. David Calloway sat alone in his dimly lit apartment, the rain tapping softly against the window. He stared at the envelope in his hands, his name neatly typed on the front in bold black ink. The return address was from a law firm he didn't recognize. Inside was a letter, formally worded, cold, and to the point. Dear Mr. Calloway, we regret to inform you of the passing of Mr. Elias Holloway, a distant relative of yours. As per his last will and testament, you have been named the sole heir to his estate, including the property located at 42 Blackwood Lane, Holloway Town. We request your presence at the estate for a formal transfer of ownership. Sincerely, Richard Hargrove. Yes? David frowned. Holloway Town. He had never heard of it. And Elias Holloway. No name in his family tree had ever mentioned such a man. Still, curiosity gnawed at him. His life in the city had been dull, monotonous work days, a failed relationship, and the constant feeling that he was stuck in place. Maybe this was a sign, an opportunity for something new. 2 days later, he packed his bags and set out on the road. The arrival. The drive took longer than expected. As David left the main highway, the roads became narrower, the trees taller, their twisted branches blocking out most of the sky. His GPS signal flickered, then disappeared entirely. Just great. He followed the remaining directions on paper, his car winding through fog-covered roads until he saw the first sign. Welcome to Holloway Town. The town was unsettling. Small, quiet, too quiet. The streets were lined with old brick buildings, their windows dark. A few people walked by, but they moved strangely, their heads turning just slightly too late to acknowledge him. At a gas station, he stopped to ask for directions. The old man behind the counter looked at him with sunken eyes. You're the Calloway boy. His voice was dry, brittle. David hesitated. Yeah, I guess. Do you know my family? The man didn't answer. Instead, he gave a slow, stiff nod and pointed towards the road ahead. House is up the hill. Don't stay out after dark. Before David could ask more, the man turned away. The house on Blackwood Lane. David's car crept up the gravel driveway, stopping before an iron gate. Beyond it stood the house, his inheritance. It was massive, an old Victorian mansion with towering spires and arched windows. The wood was faded, the paint peeling. The windows, though intact, seemed unnaturally dark, as if the glass swallowed the sunlight. A crow called from a dead tree nearby, its black wings rustling against the cold wind. David stepped out, shivering as a strange unease settled over him. He pushed the gate open with a loud creak and walked towards the front porch. The wooden boards groaned under his weight. He reached for the doorknob. It was already unlocked. With a deep breath, he stepped inside. First steps into darkness. The air was thick with dust, and the faint scent of something rotting lingered. The entrance hall was grand but lifeless. A massive chandelier hung above, covered in cobwebs. A long staircase led upward into darkness. To his left was a parlor, its furniture draped in white sheets. To his right, a study, where books lined the shelves in eerie precision. David's footsteps echoed as he moved inside. Why does it feel like someone's watching me? As he explored, he noticed old portraits on the walls, people with hollow eyes and unreadable expressions. His gaze locked onto one in particular. It was a family portrait, dated 1943. A man and woman stood behind a small boy, their hands resting protectively on his shoulders. The boy's face was oddly familiar. Dark hair, sharp features, the same piercing blue eyes as David. He stepped closer, his heartbeat quickening. The plaque below read, "The Holloway Family." He touched the frame lightly. Thud. David spun around. The sound had come from upstairs, a heavy, deliberate thump. His breath caught in his throat. He was alone, wasn't he? Then from the hallway, a whisper, soft, low, almost playful. "Welcome home." Chapter 2. First Night. The whisper sent a chill down David's spine. He spun around, his eyes scanning the dimly lit hallway. Nothing. The house was silent again, except for the faint creaking of the wooden floor beneath his feet. "I must be imagining things," he told himself. "Old houses make noises." Trying to shake off the unease, he walked back to the entrance and retrieved his bag from the car. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, eerie shadows across the front yard. A cold wind rustled the dead leaves along the path. David hesitated for a moment before stepping back inside. As the door shut behind him, a strange sensation washed over him, like he had just sealed himself inside a cage, settling in. He found the main power switch near the staircase and flipped it on. The lights flickered weakly, some bulbs buzzing before dying out completely, leaving parts of the house in shadow. At least there's some power. He made his way to the study, where an old leather armchair sat near a stone fireplace. It was the warmest looking spot in the entire house. Dropping his bag beside the chair, he let out a breath. Just one night. I'll check everything tomorrow. His fingers traced the edges of an old book left open on the desk. The pages were yellowed, filled with handwritten notes in elegant cursive. The ink had faded, but one line stood out, darker than the rest. "The house remembers." A shiver crawled up his neck. The wind outside howled, rattling the windows. The temperature seemed to drop and David pulled his jacket tighter around him. That's when he heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from upstairs. He froze, his heartbeat pounding in his ears. The sound continued, creaking along the floorboards above him. Someone was walking in the hallway on the second floor. No, that's impossible. I'm alone. Summoning his courage, David grabbed the fireplace poker and stepped into the hall. He tilted his head, listening. Silence. Then, crack! A door upstairs slowly swung open. David's grip tightened on the poker. Do I check, or do I leave? Something deep inside him whispered, leave. But another part, curiosity, or maybe foolishness, urged him forward. His feet moved before his mind could protest. The upstairs hallway. The second floor was even darker than the first. The light from a single weak bulb barely reached the hallway walls. The air was colder here, thick with dust and something else, something rotten. David's eyes darted to the end of the corridor. A door stood slightly open. It was the only one. That wasn't open before. He took slow, careful steps toward it. The floor creaked under his weight. He could hear his own breathing, shallow and unsteady. As he reached the door, he hesitated. A soft sound came from inside, scratching, like fingernails against wood. David swallowed hard and nudged the door open with the tip of the fireplace poker. The hinges groaned in protest. The room was small and empty, except for an old wooden crib in the center. His breath hitched. The scratching had stopped. He stepped inside, his pulse hammering in his throat. A thick layer of dust covered everything, as if the room had been untouched for decades. Then he saw it. On the wall, above the crib, were deep scratches. Marks dug into the wood as if someone had clawed at it desperately, and scrawled beneath the marks, in faded red letters. "Don't forget!" David took a step back, his chest tightening. Then from behind him, in the darkness of the hallway, a whisper. "You already did." A cold hand brushed his shoulder. David whirled around, heart slamming against his ribs. Nothing but the door. The door to the room was now shut on the sleepless night. David barely remembered running back downstairs, his hands shaking as he locked himself inside the study. He shoved the heavy armchair against the door, as if that would keep something out. The house was silent again, but David knew he wasn't alone. He sat in the chair, gripping the poker like a lifeline, his ears straining for the slightest sound. The fire in the fireplace crackled softly, casting shadows that flickered across the walls. He wouldn't sleep. He couldn't sleep. And somewhere in the house, just beyond the edge of the firelight, something watched, waiting. Chapter 3: The Locked Room. David barely slept. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a dim orange glow across the study. He sat in the armchair, still gripping the fireplace poker, his body tense. Every creak, every whisper of wind against the windows made his pulse jump. Morning didn't bring relief, only a sense of deep unease. The events of the night before clawed at his mind. The footsteps, the whisper, the cold touch on his shoulder, and that room. "Don't forget!" The words on the wall were burned into his memory. David forced himself to breathe. I need to check the house in daylight. Maybe I was just exhausted. Maybe it was all in my head. But deep down, he knew it wasn't. Morning light, lingering shadows. He left the study, stretching his stiff limbs. Sunlight filtered weakly through the dusty windows, giving the house a ghostly glow. The second floor felt different in the daylight. Less threatening, but still wrong. David retraced his steps to the room from last night. The door stood open. Inside, the crib remained, covered in dust. The scratches on the wall were still there, but now in the brightness of day, the red lettering beneath them seemed faded, almost blending into the wood. Was it really that vivid last night? He stepped closer, running his fingers over the grooves. The marks were deep, as if made by desperate hands. Who made these? A chill crawled up his spine. He turned away, stepping back into the hallway. That's when he saw it. Further down the corridor, past the other rooms, was a door. A locked door. The door that won't open. David hadn't noticed it before. Or maybe he had, but something in his mind refused to acknowledge it until now. The door was different from the others. Made of darker wood, its handle rusted with age. No keyhole, no sign of forced entry, just locked. Something about it made his skin prickle. He tried turning the knob. It didn't budge. He pressed his ear against the wood, listening. Nothing. And yet, an overwhelming sense of presence radiated from behind it, as if something was waiting. A sudden knock from the other side made him stumble back. David's breath caught in his throat. He stared at the door, his heartbeat a deafening drum in his ears. Silence. Then knock, knock, knock. Slow, rhythmic, deliberate. He took another step back, and then, faintly, from behind the door, a voice. A child's voice. "Who's there?" David's blood ran cold. The voice was small, distant, but unmistakably real. His mouth was dry. He tried to speak, but no words came out. Then, after a long pause, the voice spoke again. "David, is that you?" David bolted, questions without answers. Back downstairs, David splashed cold water on his face in the kitchen sink. His hands were shaking. "This is insane. I need to get out of here." But something held him back. The voice knew his name. He had never lived here before, had never even heard of Holloway Town before this inheritance. Then why did this house feel familiar? Why did that room feel familiar? He grabbed his phone, checking for a signal. Still nothing. He considered driving back into town, asking someone, anyone, about the house, but he doubted they would tell him anything useful. The old man at the gas station's warning echoed in his head. "Don't stay out after dark." Was that a general warning? Or something worse? David clenched his fists. He needed answers, and he had a feeling they were behind that locked door. A clue in the attic. Determined, he decided to search the house for a key. He started with the study, rummaging through drawers and cabinets. Dusty papers, old letters, nothing useful. Next, he searched the master bedroom. More furniture covered in sheets, an old wardrobe filled with moth-eaten clothes. But no key. His last hope was the attic. David climbed the narrow staircase leading to the attic door. It groaned as he pushed it open. The attic smelled of mold and old wood. Sunlight streamed through the cracks in the roof, illuminating broken furniture, forgotten trunks, and a small wooden box on a dusty table. His heart pounded as he approached. The box was plain, unmarked, but locked with a tiny brass latch. David hesitated, then pried it open with the poker. The latch snapped. Inside was a single object, a rusted key. His breath hitched. He lifted it, feeling its cold weight in his palm. Is this for the locked room? Only one way to find out. Nightfall and the chores. The sky outside was darkening by the time David descended from the attic. He hadn't realized how much time had passed. A deep, unsettled feeling coiled in his stomach. Should I wait until morning, or open it now? His gut told him that whatever was behind that door wanted him to open it. His fingers tightened around the key. A whisper drifted from the second floor. "David?" He looked up. The hallway was dark, stretching into the unknown. The locked door was waiting, and so was whatever lay beyond it. Chapter 4. The door opens. David stood at the base of the staircase, staring up into the darkness. The key felt heavy in his palm. The whisper still echoed in his mind, soft, distant, but unmistakable. "David!" Every instinct screamed at him to leave the house, but something stronger, something buried deep within him, pushed him forward. "I need to know." With slow, deliberate steps, he climbed the stairs. The moment of truth. The hallway felt colder than before. The locked door stood at the far end, bathed in the weak glow of the single flickering bulb overhead. David's pulse pounded as he approached. He hesitated for only a second before sliding the rusted key into the lock. Click. The door unlocked. He pushed it open. The hinges groaned, revealing a dark windowless room. The air inside was stale, thick with the scent of damp wood and something faintly metallic. David hesitated before stepping inside. The floorboards creaked beneath his weight. His eyes adjusted to the darkness, revealing a chair in the center of the room. Strapped to it were leather restraints, cracked with age. Scattered across the floor were deep scratches, like someone had clawed at the wood, trying to escape. And on the far wall, written in what looked like dried blood, was a single word: forgotten. A wave of dizziness washed over him. No, this isn't right. The air in the room suddenly shifted. David felt it before he heard it, like a change in pressure, a shift in reality itself. Then, a breath. Behind him, his body went rigid. Slowly he turned his head, and saw her, the woman in the shadows. She stood just inside the doorway, barely visible in the dim light. A woman. Long tangled hair, sunken eyes, skin too pale, almost translucent. She wasn't moving. David's throat tightened. Who are you? She tilted her head slightly as if considering his question. Then in a hoarse whisper, she spoke. You came back. David felt a sharp, unnatural chill settle in his bones. What? I've never been here before. The woman took a slow step forward. Her bare feet didn't make a sound on the wooden floor. Why did you forget? She whispered. David stepped back, his mind racing. Forget? What? She didn't answer. Instead, she raised her hand, thin fingers trembling, and pointed to the chair in the center of the room. David followed her gaze, and then a vision slammed into his mind. A memory that isn't his pain. Cold metal against skin. The feeling of being tied down. A voice, deep, angry. You need to remember. Struggling, clawing at the restraints, screaming, and then a whisper in his ear. You will forget. David gasped, stumbling back against the wall. His vision blurred, heart racing. What the hell was that? The woman was still there, staring at him. Tears streamed down her pale cheeks. You promised, she whispered. You promised you wouldn't forget. David shook his head, panic clawing at his chest. I don't know what you're talking about. Her face twisted in pain. They made you forget. Her fingers curled into fists, and now the air crackled. Her shadow stretched unnaturally across the room, and you will remember. The door slammed shut behind her. Darkness swallowed them both. Chapter 5. You will remember. Darkness swallowed the room. David's breath came in short, ragged gasps as he pressed himself against the cold wooden wall. The woman stood in front of him, her pale face barely visible in the pitch-black space. Then, a whisper, not from her, from all around him. A chorus of voices, overlapping, murmuring things he couldn't understand. His skin prickled, and as an icy wind swirled through the room, carrying fragments of distant, tortured cries. Then the woman spoke again. You don't remember, do you? David's throat was dry. I don't know you. She took a step forward. The floor beneath them groaned, as if something beneath it was shifting. You do, she whispered. They took it from you. But the house remembers. David's head throbbed with a sharp stabbing pain. His vision blurred. Images flickered through his mind. Half-formed memories. Shadows of things just beyond reach. Then, a flash. A younger version of himself, standing in this same house, staring at the same locked door, his fingers holding a different key. Someone beside him, a woman. Her face was blurred, unrecognizable, but she was crying. David, she had pleaded, please don't do this. A deep voice, his own, cold and distant. You shouldn't have come back. The memory shattered. David gasped, stumbling forward, gripping his head. What was that? The woman was closer now, inches from his face. "You promise?" David shook his head violently. "No, this isn't real. I've never been here before." The whispers around him grew louder. The woman's expression twisted with something unreadable. Pain, anger, sorrow. "You have," she said, "and you will again." She reached out. Cold fingers pressed against his forehead, and everything collapsed. The forgotten past. David fell. Not physically, but through memories, through time itself. The world around him twisted, and suddenly he wasn't in the locked room anymore. He was somewhere else. The house was new, untouched by dust and decay. The walls were clean, the floors polished. The air was warm, filled with the scent of fresh wood and candle wax. David stood in the main hallway, but he wasn't alone. A woman stood beside him. This time he could see her clearly. Dark hair, soft brown eyes, a familiar face. A name surfaced in his mind, unbidden. Anna. His heart clenched. "I know her." She turned to him, her expression filled with love and something else. Fear. "This place is wrong, David," she whispered. But he had ignored her. He saw himself, his past self, standing tall, looking at her with an expression that wasn't his own. Cold, unfeeling. "This house is ours," his past self had said. Anna had grabbed his arm. "Please listen to me. We need to leave. This place, it doesn't want us here." David's past self had smiled, not with kindness, with something darker. And then he reached into his pocket, pulled out a key, and unlocked the door to the room. Anna had gasped, stepped back, shook her head. "David, don't!" But it was too late. The moment the door swung open, the house changed. The walls darkened, the floors cracked, the warm air turned ice cold, and something else awakened inside. A force, a presence, something that had been waiting. Anna had screamed. David's vision blurred. His past self turned to her, expression blank, distant, and then the memory broke apart. Back in the room, David crashed back into reality. His legs buckled, and he collapsed onto the floor, gasping for air. The whispers had stopped. The room was silent again, except for the woman. She was kneeling beside him now, watching him with sad eyes. "You remember now, don't you?" David swallowed hard. His pulse hammered against his ribs. His voice cracked. "I don't understand." Tears welled in her eyes. "You left me." Something inside him broke. "No." Her voice trembled. "You promised you'd never forget." David's hands shook. The temperature in the room plunged. A low guttural growl rumbled from the walls themselves. The woman's eyes widened in fear. "They know." David barely had time to react before the door behind her slammed open, and something dragged her into the darkness. She didn't scream. She just stared at him, one final heartbroken whisper escaping her lips. "Don't forget me again." And then she was gone. The darkness swallowed the room, rushing toward David like a wave. And then, blackness. Chapter 6. The Other Side. Silence. David floated in nothingness. A vast, endless void surrounded him, cold and suffocating. There was no light, no sound, just an emptiness that stretched forever. Then, a voice, soft, distant. "David." He spun around, but there was nothing. Another voice followed, then another, until the void was filled with whispers, some pleading, some accusing. David clutched his head. "Stop! Stop it!" The voices grew louder, and then a single booming sound, like a door slamming shut. Everything shifted. The red room David's body hit the ground. Hard. The impact knocked the breath from his lungs. He coughed, pushing himself up. The darkness was gone. He was in a room, but it wasn't the one he had unlocked earlier. This place was wrong. The walls were deep red, pulsing as if they were alive. The ceiling was impossibly high, stretching into blackness. The air smelled like rust and decay, and in the center of the room, a mirror. Tall, cracked, standing alone. David staggered to his feet, his heart pounding. He didn't want to look, but something compelled him. Slowly, he stepped towards the mirror, and what he saw made his blood freeze. The reflection that wasn't him. David stared at his reflection, except it wasn't him. The man in the mirror looked like him. Same face, same eyes, but there was something wrong. His skin was pale, almost gray. His eyes were sunken, dark hollows staring back, and his expression was completely void of emotion. David swallowed hard. The reflection didn't move. His real body trembled. Then, the other David smiled. Not a normal smile. A slow, twisted grin that spread too wide across his face. David stumbled back. His reflection stepped forward. The glass cracked beneath its feet, spiderwebbing outward. And then, the other David spoke. "Welcome back." His voice was his own, but distorted, deeper, more ancient. David shook his head violently. No, this isn't real." The reflection tilted its head, the grin never fading. "Oh, but it is," it whispered. "You should know that by now." David's pulse thundered in his ears. "Who are you?" The reflection just laughed, a cold, hollow sound that made David's stomach twist. Then it spoke three words that made his knees buckle. "I am you." David's breath caught in his throat. No. The other David reached out, pressed a single hand against the cracked glass, and from the mirror a black liquid began to seep out, thick, oily, crawling toward David's feet like living shadows. He backpedaled. The liquid spread, creeping up the walls, dripping from the ceiling. The entire room was dissolving into darkness, and then the hands emerged. Long clawed fingers reaching from the blackness, grasping at his legs, his arms, his throat, dragging him down. David screamed. The awakening. His eyes flew open. He was somewhere else, lying on cold, dusty floorboards, gasping for breath. David sat up, his heart still hammering. He was back in the house. The red room was gone. The mirror was gone. Everything was normal, or at least as normal as it could be. The locked door stood open. The chair with the restraints was still there, but she was gone. The woman, Anna. David pushed himself to his feet, unsteady. Had any of that been real? His fingers touched his face, his arms, his chest. He was still himself, right? Then his gaze fell to the floor, his breath caught. There in the dust were footprints, not just his own. A second set, leading away from the chair. leading out the door, and on the far wall, the word forgotten was gone, replaced by something else. Something that sent a deep sinking feeling through David's stomach. A single phrase, written in what looked like fresh black ink. You will remember. David exhaled shakily. The house was silent, but he wasn't alone. Something was still here, and it was waiting. Chapter 7. The Mark. David stood frozen, staring at the words on the wall. You will remember. His breath came in shallow, uneven gasps. His body felt weak, drained, like something had been taken from him. The house was silent, but the weight of something unseen pressed against his chest. Something was still watching him. Slowly, he took a step back. The floorboards groaned under his weight. The footprints, his and someone else's, led out of the room, disappearing into the shadows beyond the door. He didn't want to follow them, but he had to. I need to understand. With slow, careful steps, he stepped into the dark hallway. The old bedroom. The air in the hallway felt thicker now, like the house was breathing around him. Dust floated in the dim light, swirling as he moved forward. The wooden walls were warped, cracked, rotting. And then he saw it. A door at the end of the hall. It was slightly open. A soft, flickering glow pulsed from within. David's fingers trembled as he pushed the door open. The room inside was small, filled with old furniture covered in dust. A single oil lamp flickered on a bedside table, casting long, shifting shadows. The air smelled of damp wood and something metallic, and in the center of the room, an old bed. The blankets were pulled back, revealing a mattress stained dark with something long dried, and on the pillow, a handprint. Not just any handprint, a black handprint, burned into the fabric. David's stomach twisted. What is this place? His fingers brushed against the edge of the bed. The moment he touched it, the room shifted. The air rippled. The walls seemed to move, warping like liquid. And then, a whisper. You left me. David spun around, and there she was. Anna, standing in the doorway, eyes hollow, tears running down her pale cheeks. You left me here, she whispered. David's pulse pounded in his ears. No, I don't remember. I swear I don't remember. She took a step forward. Her feet didn't make a sound. Her voice trembled. They made you forget. David's hands balled into fists. Who did this to me? She didn't answer. Instead, she slowly raised her hand, pointed to his chest. David looked down and felt his blood run cold. There on his skin, just above his heart, a black handprint burned into his flesh, just like the one on the pillow. David staggered back, gripping his shirt. His breath came in sharp, panicked gasps. No, this isn't real. The handprint burned, a searing pain spreading through his chest. Anna's voice was barely a whisper. They marked you? David's vision blurred. His head throbbed. Dark spots danced across his vision as the pain intensified. He barely heard her final words before everything faded. "Now they'll come for you." The nightmare darkness swallowed him whole. David fell, spinning, spiraling. His mind drifted through half-formed memories, broken images flashing before his eyes. The house, the locked room, the mirror, Anna pleading with him, and then a voice, low, deep, not Anna's, something else, something old. "You will never leave." David's body jerked violently. Pain shot through him, burning through his veins like liquid fire. And then his eyes snapped open. Back in the house, he was lying on the cold wooden floor, gasping for breath. The house was silent. His chest ached. His hands were trembling. David slowly sat up, wincing, and then he saw it. The handprint on his skin was still there, darker, more defined, and it was spreading. Thin black veins crawled outward from the mark, twisting across his chest like roots. David's stomach twisted with dread. Something had changed. Something was inside him now. And for the first time, a terrifying thought crept into his mind. Maybe I was never supposed to leave this house. Chapter 8, The Whispering Walls. David sat frozen on the cold wooden floor, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps. The black handprint on his chest burned like an open wound, its dark veins creeping further along his skin. A sickness spread through his body. Something was changing inside him. He clenched his fists, trying to steady himself, but then the house breathed. A long, slow creak echoed through the walls, like an exhaled sigh, and then the whispers began, the voices in the dark soft, murmuring, too many to count. They came from everywhere, from behind the cracked wallpaper, from under the warped floorboards, from inside the walls. David pushed himself up, swaying. His head throbbed, his vision still blurry. The whispers grew louder, and then one voice stood out, a whisper directly behind him. "You remember now, don't you?" David's body went rigid. He turned. The hallway was empty, but something was there, watching, waiting. His pulse hammered. Then, a sudden knock. Once, twice, then a slow rhythmic pounding from inside the walls. David staggered backward. The wood bulged, like something was pushing against it from the other side. The whispers became choking laughter, and then the wall split open. The hidden room. A jagged crack tore through the wooden panels, revealing a dark passage beyond. Cold air spilled out, carrying the scent of damp earth and decay. David's instinct screamed at him to run, but his feet carried him forward, through the opening, into the dark, the staircase below. The passage was narrow, the walls pressing in from both sides. The wooden boards beneath his feet turned to stone, and then a staircase, worn, crumbling, leading down into the abyss. David hesitated. But behind him, the whispering grew frantic, more urgent, and then, just as before, a voice spoke his name, not in a whisper, not in a murmur, but a deep, ancient voice. David, a voice that knew him, that had always known him. The walls shook, the opening behind him began to close. No turning back now. Heart pounding, he took the first step downward. The mark awakens. With every step, the dark veins creeping from the handprint on his chest past. The deeper he went, the stronger the pain became. It was as if the mark was reacting to something below, to something waiting for him. The air grew colder, and then at the bottom of the stairs, he saw it. A door, massive, ancient, made of blackened wood and covered in symbols he didn't understand. His stomach twisted, because one of the symbols was the same as the mark on his chest. A realization settled over him like a lead weight. He had been here before. His fingers trembled as he reached out, touched the cold, worn surface. The moment his skin made contact, the whispers stopped, a silence heavier than anything he had ever felt. And then, a single voice, clear, soft, right behind him. "You never left." David's blood turned to ice. He turned and saw who was standing there. A face he recognized. A face he could never forget, because it was his own. Chapter 9. The Truth Beneath. David's breath caught in his throat. The figure standing before him was himself. The same face, the same eyes, but not quite. This other David was different. His skin was pale, his veins darkened like the creeping mark on David's own chest. His expression was empty, but his eyes burned with something ancient, something hungry. David's mind screamed at him to move, to run, but his body refused. The air was heavy, pressing down on him like unseen hands. Then the other David smiled, a slow, unnatural grin. "You've come back," he whispered. David swallowed hard. "Who? What are you?" The other David tilted his head. "I am you," he said softly. David's stomach twisted. "No, that's impossible." The figure stepped forward, bare feet silent on the stone floor. "You don't remember, do you?" David took a step back. The door behind him loomed, the strange symbol seeming to shift in the dim light. The mark on his chest burned. A sudden wave of memories crashed through his mind. Flashes of the house, the mirror, Anna's voice calling his name, the feeling of something being ripped away from him. The other David's eyes darkened. "You were never supposed to leave." David shook his head, gripping his temples as the pain intensified. I don't understand." The figure smiled. "You will." And then he lunged. The struggle, David barely had time to react. The other David moved impossibly fast, his hands reaching for David's throat. David stumbled back, slamming into the door behind him. The moment his back touched the wood, a deep rumbling filled the chamber. The symbols on the door glowed, pulsing with a sickly light. And then, the door swung open. A black void stretched beyond. A pulling force, strong, relentless, ripped through the room. David and his other self were both yanked forward, tumbling into the darkness. The last thing David saw before the world vanished was the other David's face, smiling. And then, everything collapsed. The forgotten place. When David's eyes opened, he was somewhere else. Not the basement, not the house. A vast empty space surrounded him, the air thick with mist, the ground beneath his feet cold and damp. A place that felt wrong, like it shouldn't exist. And in the distance, a figure, standing alone in the fog. David's breath hitched. It was Anna. Her back was to him, her hair falling in loose waves over her shoulders. She didn't move. David took a slow step forward. Anna. His voice was barely above a whisper. She stiffened. Then slowly she turned to face him. David's stomach dropped. Her eyes, they were hollow. Dark voids that seemed to swallow the light. A whisper drifted through the air. Not from Anna, from the shadows around them. You left her here. David's pulse pounded. His own voice was faint in his ears. No, I didn't. Anna stepped forward. Her lips trembled. You promised. David shook his head violently. I don't remember any of this. The whispers swelled, circling around him like a storm. You chose to forget. And then the ground beneath him split open. Darkness surged upward, swallowing everything. Anna's face disappeared into the void. David screamed, and the world collapsed again. The final memory. David's body jerked awake. He was back, inside the house, lying on the cold floor of the hallway. His entire body ached, his skin slick with sweat. For a moment, he couldn't breathe. Then, a slow tapping sound. He turned his head, and his blood froze. The mirror at the end of the hallway was no longer cracked. It was clear, and inside it, his reflection was smiling. Chapter 10. The Mirror's Truth. David lay on the cold wooden floor, his breath shallow, his body aching. The whispers had stopped. The house was silent again. But something was wrong. His gaze locked onto the mirror at the end of the hallway. The cracked glass was now perfectly smooth, and inside it, his reflection stared back. A reflection that was smiling, not a normal smile. Something unnatural, wrong. A slow, stretching grin that didn't belong to him. David's chest tightened. His own reflection was watching him. And then, it moved. Not like a normal reflection. It stepped forward, pressing its hands against the inside of the glass. David's breath hitched. This wasn't just a mirror. It was a door, and something was trying to get out. The reflection speaks. David scrambled to his feet, his pulse pounding in his ears. The reflection tilted its head, its expression one of amusement. Then, in a voice that was his but not his, it spoke. You finally made it back. David's hands clenched into fists. Back? I was never here. The reflection laughed softly, a slow, deliberate sound. You've forgotten everything, haven't you? David's throat tightened. What did I forget? The reflection pressed a hand to the glass, and suddenly the mark on David's chest burned, searing pain spreading through his veins. Images flashed through his mind. Anna, the locked room, the black door in the basement, and then a final memory, a night long ago. Standing in front of the mirror, Anna crying, begging him not to do it, and his own voice, cold and detached. It's the only way. David staggered back, his head spinning. No, that's not real. That's not real. The reflection's smile widened. But it is. The mirror shuddered. The glass rippled like water. And then the reflection stepped forward, emerging from the mirror. The other David stumbled backward, his breath caught in his throat. His own double now stood before him, identical in every way, except for his eyes. Dark, hollow, filled with something ancient and wrong. The other David took a slow step forward. You thought you could escape, he murmured. You thought you could forget. David shook his head. I don't know what you're talking about. The other David's grin faltered. Then his expression darkened. Liar! Suddenly the walls trembled. The house groaned, as if coming alive. And then a whisper drifted through the air. Not from the house, from the mirror. A familiar voice. David, please, stop him. David's blood ran cold. Anna. Her voice was coming from inside the mirror. His hands trembled. What? What did I do? The other David's face twisted into something cruel. You locked her away. The words hit him like a punch to the gut. David stared at the mirror, at the darkness swirling inside it, and for the first time, he remembered the forgotten sin, a memory, the truth. Years ago, he had found this mirror, a doorway to something beyond reality, something old, something that whispered promises of power, knowledge, eternity. And he had listened. He had opened the door, but the cost, it had been Anna. She had tried to stop him, begged him not to go through with it. And he had trapped her inside. His own voice echoed in his skull. It's the only way. David's legs weakened. The weight of the truth crushed him. His reflection, no, the other David was still watching him, his dark eyes glowing. She's waiting for you, he said softly. David turned back to the mirror. The shadows inside it swirled, and there, barely visible, Anna, her face pale, her eyes filled with fear. David, she whispered. Don't let him win. David's heart raced. The other David laughed. Too late, he whispered, and then he lunged. The breaking point, David barely had time to react. His other self crashed into him, sending him slamming into the wall. The house shook violently. The mirror flickered, its surface rippling. David struggled, shoving the other David back. But his double was strong. Too strong. You can't fight me. The other David growled. I am you. David's chest burned. The mark was spreading. Black veins creeping up his neck, down his arms. If he didn't stop this now, he would become the thing in the mirror. The other David lunged again, but this time, David was ready. He dodged, grabbing the edge of the mirror with both hands. Anna's voice echoed in his mind. "Stop him!" David looked into the glass, into the darkness beyond. And then he made a choice. With every ounce of strength left in his body, he shoved the other David into the mirror. The reflection's eyes widened. No. David pushed harder. The surface rippled, pulling his double back inside. Dark hands, Anna's hands, shot out from the void, grabbing the other David, dragging him into the depths. His screams filled the air, and then the mirror shattered. Silence. David collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath. The house was still. The whispers were gone, and the mirror just a broken frame. The darkness inside it had vanished. David's vision blurred. His chest still burned, but the veins were receding. Anna's voice drifted through the air, soft and fading. "Thank you." And then she was gone. David lay there staring at the ceiling, and for the first time in a long time, he was alone. But the question remained, was it truly over? Chapter 11, The Haunting Silence. David lay motionless on the cold wooden floor, his chest rising and falling in uneven breaths. The shattered mirror lay in pieces beside him, shards reflecting his wide, unblinking eyes. The house was silent, too silent. The whispers were gone, the shadows had receded, and Anna, she was gone too. David slowly pushed himself up, his arms trembling. His body felt weak, as if something had been drained from him. He reached for his chest where the dark veins had spread. They were fading now, but the mark remained. A deep black imprint, shaped like a twisted symbol, burned into his skin just above his heart. A reminder of what he had done and what he had lost. The house that wouldn't let go. David turned his gaze to the hallway. The walls were quiet now, no longer shifting or groaning. The house felt empty, like something had been ripped from it. Or maybe it had been waiting for this. David's fingers clenched. He had won, hadn't he? He forced himself to stand, swaying slightly as he stepped towards the front door. The wood was rotted, the brass handle cold beneath his fingers. For the first time since entering this cursed place, the door was unlocked. David hesitated. He reached for the knob and turned it. The door creaked open. A gust of cold night air swept through, sending a shiver down his spine. Freedom. He stepped over the threshold, and as his foot touched the ground outside, something changed. The silence was suddenly deafening. A weight settled over his chest, like something was watching him, waiting. He turned, staring at the house, and then his heart stopped. The windows, they were filled with shadows. Dozens of figures stood inside, motionless, watching him. Their faces were empty, their eyes hollow and black. Among them, a woman, standing in the center. her pale face barely visible in the darkness, her eyes wide with sorrow. "Anna!" David's breath hitched. "Anna," he whispered, but she didn't move. None of them did. And then, the door slammed shut behind him. A world that felt wrong. David stumbled back, his heart hammering. The house loomed before him, its once decayed walls now pristine. The broken windows, whole again. The shattered mirror, gone. It was as if the house had been reset, as if he had never been inside at all. David turned sharply, taking in his surroundings. The street, the trees, the sky overhead. Something was wrong. The air felt too still. The houses on the street, they were dark, their windows empty and lifeless. There were no streetlights, no distant city noise, no wind, just nothing. David's breath came faster. He turned in circles, trying to ground himself. This was his world, wasn't it? The world he had fought to return to. His eyes darted to his own hands. They were trembling, but something else. Something subtle, something small made his stomach drop. His shadow. It stretched unnaturally long beneath him, and then it moved on its own, not alone. David staggered back, his pulse hammering in his ears. The shadow beneath him shifted, its edges writhing like smoke. It wasn't just a shadow, it was something else. Something that had followed him out of the house. A low whisper drifted through the air. A familiar voice. "You never really left." David's breath caught. He turned, and for a split second he saw it. A shape, tall, twisted, standing just beyond the street lamp's reach, watching him. Then it was gone. Vanished into the silence. David staggered back. His mind screamed at him to run, to escape. But deep down, he already knew the truth. He hadn't escaped at all. The house, the mirror, the shadows, they were still with him. And no matter where he ran, they always would be. Chapter 12. The War That Never Closes. David stood frozen in the empty street. The silence pressed in from all sides, thick and suffocating. His shadow no longer moved, but he knew it was still watching, somewhere, waiting. He forced himself to breathe. This was the real world, wasn't it? The houses looked familiar. The cracked pavement beneath his feet felt solid, but everything was too still, too perfect. And then, the whisper came again, a voice inside his head. "You never really left." The town that wasn't real. David started walking. His legs felt heavy, but he pushed forward. The town stretched ahead of him, empty and silent. He passed houses with curtains drawn, windows dark. Not a single car, not a single person. His hometown was deserted. No streetlights, no breeze, no life. His throat tightened. Something was wrong. He quickened his pace. His own footsteps echoed, too loud in the stillness. He turned a corner, and his stomach dropped. There it was. The house. The house he had escaped from, standing at the end of the street. as if it had been waiting for him all along. The door was open, welcoming. David's breath hitched. No, this isn't possible. He had left. He had gotten out. But deep down, he knew the truth. The house had never been a place. It was a prison, and no one ever left. The reflection returns. David turned and came face to face with himself. The other David, standing in the street, unmoving, his black eyes empty, his mouth curled into a smile. "Welcome home," the reflection whispered. David stumbled back, his heart hammering. "This isn't real. It's a trick." But the other David took a slow step forward, then another, and another. David turned and ran, the chase. His feet pounded against the pavement. Buildings blurred past him. He needed to get out of this town, out of this nightmare. But no matter how fast he ran, the streets stretched on forever. Every corner led to another empty road. Every turn brought him back to the house. His lungs burned, his legs ached, but still he ran until a shape loomed in front of him, tall, twisted, waiting, watching, the figure from before. David skidded to a stop, and then it spoke. A voice like 1,000 whispers at once. "It's time!" The world shifted, the shadows rose, and the town collapsed into darkness. The door that never closes. David gasped as he hit the floor. Cold, hard, he looked up, and his blood turned to ice. He was back inside the house. The hallway stretched before him. The shattered mirror was whole again. The front door was closed, locked, waiting, and standing beside the mirror, the other David, smiling. "You never left," he whispered. David's breath came in ragged gasps. The mark on his chest burned. Everything had reset. He was trapped forever. And then the whisper started again. Soft, familiar, welcoming. The house had won. The door had never really closed. And this time, it never would. The end.